Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. The nature of practice, upon which we offer a number of conjectures over the conversations which follow. So I hope this particular event will give you something to hold on to and apply it to your own experience as a practitioner or a teacher of practitioners. Welcome to episode 2. Maybe that asks us to explain a little bit more about thoughts on practice and what are we talking about here? Theories? Hypotheses?
Yeah.
Propositions? What would we like people to understand?
We go round and round on this, and I think at one time or another we've entertained each of the words you just sketched. Not theories. That we're not talking about a theory of practice. No, since the last time we've talked, another word has come into my mind that is frequently used in a lot of scientific writing, but also in general conversation. That is the word conjecture. And I think that word captures more accurately what we really have in mind here. They certainly are not hypotheses. They are not based on systematic research findings, although both of us have tons of informal research and experience to suggest these conjectures about practice, the nature of practice. Which we call a capital P practice, just to remind us that we're not talking about anybody's specific practice. We're talking about practices in general. So I think I'd like to play around here with the word conjecture. That's what it feels like we're doing to me, and I hope it communicates that to our listeners.
As they hear us talk about the conjectures that we've codified so far, I will remind them often that we're more than willing to accept and listen to anyone's conjectures about the nature of practice as they're living it, as they've read about it, as they've
absolutely.
Because I think we're on the cusp of moving our attention not so much off organizational effectiveness per se, but to expand our attention to personal effectiveness with a specific focus on practice. Okay, if we're focusing on it, what is it? Why is it so important? What are we discovering so far? Conjecture. So let's do it. Let's share some conjectures. There is sort of a big conjecturing about the nature of practice upon which all the others seem to flow and rest. So could you remind us what that operational definition is?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'd call it an operational definition, but it's our way of thinking about practice in general. It's sort of our point of departure. Yeah, as we've worked it out, I would ask the listeners' indulgence. I'm going to have to read this because I haven't memorized it, but it's the way of thinking about practice that we're starting from. So here it is, the conscious ability to produce fairly consistently intended results and to do so across a range of circumstances and to do so while growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. I would go on and emphasize, so that's the end of our definition or of our working way of thinking. The conscious ability to produce fairly consistently intended results and to do so across a range of circumstances and to do so while growing and changing oneself, that would be the practitioner, to meet the challenges, to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. And we have since, I think, agreed that the key thing here is the notion of conscious ability to produce. It's not just kind of random action taking. it isn't just sort of daily behavior, you might call it. It's the conscious ability fairly consistently to produce intended results. Practice is nothing if it isn't action to produce intended results. But I think we've thickened it a little bit with these additional adjectives, you might say. I guess I also want to link this definition to something that's quite popular these days in discussions of personal growth and development, and that is the term mindfulness. That seems to us, I think, our big conjecture is that the essence of practice is mindfulness. The practitioner has a set of ideas in mind, so to speak, some of which are shared with a client or the community that the practitioner is working in relation to, but many of which are not shared. They may not even be terribly important to the practitioner. But in any event, the notion of mindfulness, the notion that one is paying attention to one's approach to things and one's own personal development, so to speak, that notion of paying attention to oneself, I think, is a very important one, listening to oneself. And our idea about effective practice is that the practitioner is doing those things and not just mindlessly going through a bunch of routines. As a client, if the practitioner is going through a bunch of mindless routines, we as a client sense that immediately, I think. That we're not being taken that seriously. We're being treated somewhat mechanistically, and that individual does not really have a very well-developed notion of his or her own practice.
It really pops up in my mind at this moment that along with mindfulness, there's a big discussion about artificial intelligence moving into even the professional sectors and taking over those routines somewhat. It seems to me that that's inevitable, inexorable. Therefore, mindfulness about what you can bring above the routine and out to more positive thinking in changing circumstances is very timely. What do you think?
Well, what occurs to me is that you've put your finger on what is going to turn out to be a real problem in robotics, and that is mindfulness. The notion of a mindful robot is almost a contradiction in terms.
That's right.
Because a robot presumably is not capable of self-modification. Mm-hmm. It's only capable of doing what it's programmed to do. And somebody would be quick to point out that the programmer can build some mindfulness in, but you can't possibly build in the full range of mindful circumstances that a live human being is capable of. If you could do that, you'd have a human being. That's what Dr. Frankenstein thought he could do, and look at the trouble it got him into.
Well, there's another part of this starting point definition that I would like to emphasize as well, Peter. That notion of continual change, the complexities, you're going to have to constantly adapt. To me, that begs for a person to become a very self-confident learner in the midst of all this change. So would you pick up on that a little bit? Because that's definitely been something we've been talking about a long time.
Well, that idea goes with some other general ideas we've had about practice, some other conjectures we've had. And one of those conjectures is that practice is continual learning. In the environment that we're living in, the environment that I like to call permanent whitewater, where there's continual change, continual upset, we're continually being placed on the borders of our comfort zones and very frequently well outside of our comfort zones. That environment puts a premium on a practitioner's ability to be a conscious learner. And with that goes another idea, which I find quite tantalizing, and that is that the learning process itself can become a practice. And, the people who hear about that are the ones in special education who've got learning difficulties and get sent off to special classes on how to study and things like that. And they're the ones that get to listen to ideas about learning, letting their learning become a practice. I once saw a little pamphlet called 14 Ways to Read a Book. And most of us, certainly I included, when we were in college, had maybe one or two ways to read the book. If it was really close to the final exam and we were really cramming, we might go through and read the summaries of every chapter.
That's right.
But if we had some time, we'd start on page 1 and rather laboriously start slogging through the text. And sometimes we never got past page 10. But in any event, the learning practice that we had was, or the studying practices that we had were pretty primitive, and there wasn't very much variety in our learning practices. So I call it tantalizing, because I realize as we have worked on this material and developed these conjectures, I have realized that intuitively I personally have a variety of learning practices, but I've never called them practice. I've never called it a practice. I'm going to start to do that, I think, at this point in my life, when I supposedly am in retirement and have nothing more to learn and practice. I'm going to start trying to develop a practice of learning to see where that goes.
Well, I think we're both doing that, in that both of us retired from the professorial status and obligations, but neither of us have been able to give up on being teachers and practicing teaching. It's who I am, and I know it's who you are, and
it's in the DNA.
It's there, but here, in order even to co-produce and develop this podcast, we're both having to adapt and learn. So this gets us back to the fundamental definition, not the fundamental, but the stated definition. Changes in our circumstances, in our context, and based on our intentions to produce results called learning about practice, so you can more appreciate it and do your own mindful practicing better, is what's calling for us to try all kinds of means to collaborate. Couple of thousand miles apart. We've had to learn technology, and now, I'm learning how to edit so we can produce these and get them out to the people listening to them. So here we are, we're modeling this basic definition. Had we no further intent to produce these results, I don't know what else we'd be doing as friends. We'd probably be wishing each other good holidays and good health. But this is an undertaking, and we're living the development of these conjectures, both having them and sharing them and codifying them, but also inviting others to do the same. Come along for the fun. And it is kind of fun.
Well, and one thing I want to be sure and mention here is that you have run a couple of workshops already in which you have tried out some of these conjectures on working adults, working practitioners. What have been some of your learnings from that experience?
Well, extraordinary. I sort of get up on the bow of the kayak heading down through white waters and balanced on one foot, because I had 100 or so New England, New York State town clerks gathering for 2 days, day and a half with me at a professional development conference. And I said, now how in hell can I I want to put some of these ideas out there to get reactions, and I don't want to lecture. So I developed a theme called Living a Practiced Life. The notion that I honor them by saying they arrived at their clerkships through election or appointment because they were identified in the community as people who were serious and intentional,
Mm-hmm.
and made sure that mistakes weren't made, but on the other hand could handle all the changes that their towns were undergoing on a day-to-day basis. And so we went through a bunch of different exercises, just like I learned to do with you, Peter, back in the day, where they would, for example, listen to a segment of the autobiography or the biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was a recorded biography. And as they listened, I asked them to pick up how way back in her early days, she was becoming more aware of what she wanted to do best in life. And it bloomed into her becoming a lawyer, then a teacher of law, and now a Supreme Court justice.
Mm-hmm.
And my point to them was, hey, there's a bit of that in all of us. And so part of your becoming mindful about living your practice life is to recognize the early signs of what you love doing best, no matter what. Because that is, in our conjecture, loving what you're doing keeps you trying it even when the circumstances become unfavorable. So we went through a lot of that. And by the end, after a number of exercises, I gave them all a little egg of silly putty and said, okay, look inside. They opened them up and I said, you see how that putty is? I mean, there's a lot of space around it, air, but that's the essence. And you can mold it, shape it, stretch it, bounce it. That's the core, what I think is the essence of practice for you. And most people agreed. And then I said, and by the way, I spared no expense on these. They were like $1.50. So that was an example, oh, Peter, of saying, okay, if we really believe in this stuff, if we're intrigued about practice, why would we want believe anyone else would be? Well, I put it to the test and I didn't get knocked out of the kayak.
That's quite a vivid demonstration that they will take with them.
Yeah.
And every time they see silly putty, they'll think of you.
Believe me, that is an easy connection. At least the silly part. But this exploration that we're inviting people to join us in should be, it's serious as hell. There's no question. If artificial intelligence is biting at our heels and there's more and more questioning as to whether college is even relevant anymore, and all these other assaults on the status quo of any sort of work behavior, we seriously think that understanding practice to a greater and greater depth is going to be an important ability and responsibility going forward. Or am I being a little, you know me, I can get hyperbolic. Am I overstating the seriousness of this, even as we're having fun with it?
Well, I don't think you're overstating the seriousness of it. I think one thing that occurs to me as you were talking, that we've been saying to each other as we've worked over these conjectures, that anything can be a practice. And it's not as if we're just talking about doctors and lawyers and consultants and accountants and people who have conscious bodies of work responsibilities that they call their practice. Mm-hmm. We're suggesting that a practice can be anything. It has to do with whether it meets that definition we had of the conscious ability to produce fairly consistently over a range of circumstances intended results. You could be an internal auditor in a large corporation, and you could still think of what you did as a practice. But you could be a weekend hobbyist as a golfer, or or in your case, or as a jogger, in my case, where you think of it as a practice, that it's not just random behavior. It's not just something you do mindlessly. It's something you do with a mind, with an eye to your own development. You do it with some immersion in the pleasure of the activity, as you said, as you just said, that the passion for the activity is central. And so I hope our listeners are considering some of the things that they do pretty frequently and pretty consciously are trying to get better at, so to speak. Learning a foreign language would be a really nice example of what could be a practice that was what would you say?
Expanding one's cultural awareness, one's
well, yeah, and that our conjectures could apply to. I love to sail, and in the years that I was sailing and racing, I had it very consciously in mind that what I had in mind, even though I didn't call it a practice, what I had in mind very, very fully meets our definition, this working way of thinking that we have about practice. There are several other areas in my life. There was a time when I had music as a practice, but I kind of let it drop, and didn't become the piano player that I wanted to become and thought I had the talent to become. But in any event, anything can be a practice. I think is an important basic statement, and I hope the listener is applying. It has something in mind, or maybe several things in mind, that might become the objects of these conjectures that we're sharing.
Yeah, that's a key point. I almost everyone I meet when I have the moment, since we started this collaboration, I've tried to tune in to what they're most enthusiastic about. What like your running and piano playing, and my gradual attempts to actually get good at golf. What are they paying attention to, no matter what? And sometimes it's just they're very fortunate. There's an alignment between that answer and the actual work they're paid for, and so there's a double reward there. But if they can't think, as the listeners can't think of how the work they're doing currently is kind of embellished by our conjectures, think of something that you get complaints about because you can't get your mind off it, and you're putting so much time into it, and you're getting so much fun and growth from it. But here's another point, Peter, that I'm sure we'll get to as we share each of these conjectures in future podcasts. When you were sailing, you were also deep into your career as a professor and a management scholar. When you were running, when you were piano playing, when you were doing these things, you also had this very engaging and somewhat demanding career. Did you think of those things as kind of sidelines, or could you see crossover lessons from sailing and from piano playing and running that emerged in what and how you taught?
That's a good question. I want to say the answer is yes.
That's the easy answer.
but I was a little more vague about it than you're making it sound like there was more precision in my awareness than I had. But I found lots of applications between things I'd learned as a runner and other issues in my life. One of them, of course, had a lot to do with health. That I learned I used to say I learned more practical physiology as a runner than about any other way I could possibly have learned it, short of going to medical school. I knew all about the knee. I knew all about ankles and arches. And I knew a lot about oxygen consumption and oxygen debt and the various kinds of things that can happen to you when you overdo it. I spent 2 hours in a medical tent once at the end of a marathon because I had totally dehydrated myself. And my body took 2 liters of saline solution, which is that's a lot of liquid.
That's a lot. You really ran it down.
Over a period of 2 hours to get me back,
Yeah.
To the land of the living, so to speak, because I had passed out cold that brought me to the medical tent in the first place. Well, you learn a lot about, as I say, practical physiology in the course of an activity like running that so profoundly affects all the systems of the body.
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot about weight loss and weight gain. And I will say here, at no cost to the listener, I'll add a bit of wisdom, which is don't expect to lose weight by becoming a runner or getting into any other systematic physical activity. You will not lose weight that way. The way to lose weight is to cut calories, period. Period.
But, I can see the analogy as you're speaking, though, between all the lessons you made a study of in order to run better and not run yourself out of existence. You look at small companies that I've been looking at closely through a social enterprise board that I'm on, and I think of endurance. I think about planning for the marathon and not the sprint. All of those analogies to running, but if I were using those analogies and no one had ever run before, it'd be what's that? I don't get it. But there's a pretty good chance that out of 12 people, at least one is a runner or tried to be a runner or wants to be a runner, and they can start to think, okay, body physiology, using your capacity wisely. All those can be factored over into what you and I taught, organizational behavior. And so the point I'm making to anyone listening is most any other practice can complement the one that seems to be most, front of mind as they talk about, if you intend it to be that way. But as Peter said, don't go crazy about it either. Don't obsess on, how can I get a lesson out of my golf game that I can take to the classroom? It comes naturally, believe me. Not my golf game, but lessons that I could bring into the classroom when I found something analogous out in the community. Well, we're running a little shorter on our budget of time here, but I'm happy that we've had a real focus on that departure point definition. Could you read it one more time? And we'll have a few more thoughts on it, but at least it'll leave people as we move next time into looking at some of these of the conjectures that we've produced so far, so they can come back to it and say, oh, okay, that's what they're talking about. Could you read it one more time, Peter?
Sure. The conscious ability to produce fairly consistently intended results and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself to meet the changing circumstances in which one's practice exists. Some of the basic ideas that we're working on. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to, in light of the fact that we may need to be coming to the end of the time that we've allotted ourselves for this particular podcast, I wanted to just quickly review some of the conjectures that we have made here.
Previews of coming attractions.
Yeah. Well, it's not previews. It's more of a summary of what we've said already.
Okay.
And that is that I think we've been emphasizing how that practice is a special kind of behavior. It's not just any kind of action taking. It's not just any kind of problem solving. We've also said that anything can be a practice. That's one of our key conjectures to encourage people who think about these issues, our listeners, and hopefully our readers down the road, will apply some of these conjectures to their own spheres of work and activity, their hobbies, the things they do for recreation. motherhood can be a practice. I think I made a note of that I wanted to be sure any listeners who are not working but actually have responsibilities outside of the workplace, motherhood and family leadership certainly is a practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the world might be a better place if more people define their parenting as a practice,
Mm-hmm.
and not just something that they had to endure. We've talked about how practice exists in an extremely turbulent environment, and that the practitioners are constantly faced with challenges to their own practices, their own ways of working and thinking, and that if they're not effective learners, their practice is in danger, is really at risk of becoming overwhelmed with the changes that are arising every day. And I call that, as you know, I call that turbulent environment permanent whitewater,
Mm-hmm.
because it's full of surprises, it's full of novelty, it's full of messiness. Many of the rapid changes that organizations face are things that they don't have a department for, so to speak. The bottom dropped out of the Atlanta Marriott hotel parking lot due to a sinkhole here a few years ago. Well, whatever the Marriott managers of that facility thought they were going to be doing that day, to have the bottom drop out of your parking lot is going to trump everything.
That's right.
If you'll excuse the expression. And so the idea of novelty and messiness, that they're not organized for many of these changes. They don't have a department for it, or they don't have key managers or key technical people who are competent to deal with the changes. Web pages exploded as a new area of business activity here beginning about 20 years ago, and most organizations didn't have a clue about what a web page was, and worse yet, they didn't have anybody on the payroll who knew what a web page was.
That's right.
And was competent to design an effective one for the organization. And now web page design is high art. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a new collection of practices that didn't exist 20 years ago. One thing we have not emphasized as much as I think needs to be emphasized, we have a conjecture that practice is value-based. A practice is value-based, mm-hmm. and it's almost could be said to be a morality. That is to say, the practitioner has an idea about the way things should be. Your doctor has an idea about the things you should be doing for your health. And he tells you what those things are. Well, a lot of it is quite science-based, but a lot of it is the doctor's own personal value system, or the science itself is based on a value system. And so the work that practitioners do is value-based. It isn't applied science. And I'd like to go into that in some detail in a future podcast, because I think it's very important.
Yeah, that merits a lot more of this format, because of if you don't have an internal gyroscope or an organizational gyroscope to keep you balanced as you're flashing through all this messes and changes and counteracting thoughts, you literally will hit the wall. And so we need to help our readers, and they need to help us tap into this notion of practice, pretty much synonymous with a value system. Not in an outgrowth of a value system. So, Peter, this has gone fast, and I hope people will tell us what they think as I set up the means of giving us feedback.
A final conjecture I'd like to remind listeners of is that practice is learning, and that you have to be an effective learner to be a practitioner, and that there is possibly such a thing as a practice of learning itself. And I would invite listeners to reflect on that tantalizing idea. What would a practice of learning itself look like? How would that go as activity that one could engage in? I think that's just a really cool notion, but I'd like to put a lot more flesh on those bones.
Well, there you have your assignment, folks. You can access your practice of learning by turning your eyes inside, because that's where it comes from and that's where it happens. I'm going to be thinking about that real quick. I could be trying to play golf tomorrow when it's going to go over 100 degrees here in Connecticut. I hope I learn before I get onto that golf course that's insane. that I can't handle 100+ degree weather. Floridians maybe, but not those. Not us.
It'd be much wiser to sit down in front of the TV and watch the British Open.
There you go.
It's going on right now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Peter. I've enjoyed our conversation as always, and I look forward to bringing another one out very soon.
So have I.